Privet, Katila, Wandingruski desu, and this is the weekly Russo-Ukrainian War update for the week of September 16th through September 22nd of 2023. And so today we're going to begin, like last week, in the Donetsk front, specifically in the Avdiivka sector. So we're going to talk about this front because this is where the most intense clashes have been taking place. So for this, I'm actually going to use Rybar's map because I think it has a more accurate perception of what's going on. But we'll return to the other map. So in this week, as we mentioned last week, the Russian forces have launched a offensive operation to encircle Avdiivka. They've attacked west from Krasnokorivka here in the north, trying to encircle from the north here, and then south from Vidania and Opina, trying to advance from the south upwards north to, and basically then have these two forces meet up and encircle Avdiivka. And once it's encircled, it's basically just a matter of time before they run out of supplies and surrender, and such. So you don't have to storm it directly. You just try to storm like kind of the villages on the side and such. So they started it last week. Has there been any progress this week? Well, there's been some progress, but there's been some changes on the battlefield as well. So last time, as we talked about, they launched an offensive from here, and they reached the villages of Stepova and Berdichi, these two villages. However, the Ukrainians have, they realized that if they lose Avdiivka, which is one of the strongest points in the entire front line, because this has been one of the most fortified areas since 2014, so it's not like they just built this in the last year or so. This is a multi-year long fortress that they've been building on. So they realized they can't let this fall, so they've sent a lot of reserves and reinforcements here, and they managed to push the Russians out from being able to capture these two villages. However, the Russians have established themselves along the rail line that reaches Avdiivka. So kind of right now the front line runs along the rail line. The Ukrainians are right now, and the Russians are, the Ukrainians are trying to dislodge the Russians from the rail line. But the Russians, so far, from by the end of this week, have basically kind of pushed back from their kind of assault here, and then kind of fortified themselves along the rail line to counteract the Ukrainian attacks. They also have established themselves in the north along the rail line as well. So it's kind of like a natural defense position here. The Ukrainians are attacking from the west here. They're also attacking from the north. But so far, the Russians are able to hold on for some of their gains here. But the biggest capture that the Russians did, the biggest gain so far, besides securing themselves along the rail line, is the capturing of the waste heap, or the slag heap, or whatever you want to call it, the trash heap, the Battle of the Trash Can. But and so basically this battle's basically been, so last week they managed to capture it. However, the Ukrainians did a counterattack and pushed the Russians out. However, this became in the gray zone. And then later, around mid this week, they managed to recapture it again. The Ukrainians are still trying to dislodge the Russians, but as of the end of this week, the Russians have established themselves along this, on this waste heap, which is the highest point in this entire Avdiivka battle space here. So this gives them the height advantage and being able to see this entire area, which is very essential. So yeah, so this is where, if we go on this map here, this map's a bit more conservative. But according to most sources, the front line kind of runs along this rail line and like around along this rail line and such. And the Ukrainians are like here, here in these areas, trying to attack and dislodge the Russians. So that's the northern sector. Again, the Russians will have to restart it and try to capture these two villages. But again, it's going to have to, we'll have to see if they'll be able to do that. And as I mentioned, this is going to be a hard operation for the Russians. This is going to be a step-by-step thing. It will take 1-2 months, maybe longer. But again, like any offensive operation, as we saw with the Ukrainian and also the Russians in Bakhmut, it's gonna take, it's not gonna be like one fell swoop in 1 week they capture this. It's gonna be like, I'm telling you that like next week, maybe the extent of the operations is they take the quarry down here or something, or maybe they capture a tree line or such, or maybe they manage to advance and take a tree line here. It's gonna be that slow. But again, it's like slowly and steady, one by one. They slowly, press until, forward, and every week the results mount until they compromise the defenses, and basically then there's a collapse, which is kind of like what we saw with Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. In the southern sector as well, there's been actually more movement in the southern sector. The On this front, the Russians managed to advance north from Vadana and reached, took a few more tree lines, a few more strongholds. They actually advanced to the west here from Vadana here as well. And there's also been clashes for the quarry right here, which is one of the strong points that the Ukrainians have that prevents the which the capture of which is a good springboard to start going towards Severna and Tunica, which are the villages that the Russians want to take on this sector, kind of like the sister villages of Bergy and Stepova. Because if these villages fall in the north and these villages fall in the south, and they manage to secure it, then they'll have direct fire control over the last. This is the last road that goes to Avdiivka. So if the Russians are fortified here, they have direct line of sight here, and especially here, they'll basically be able to just fire and destroy everything that tries to go into Avdiivka and anything that comes out. So they effectively encircled it. But, they need to take these villages first, which is kind of the purposes of the north and southern operations for now. So in the south, they got closer to Severna, while in the north, while they reached the outskirts of these villages, they were pushed back to the rail line. So, there's been, but another interesting thing is actually advancements here, which is actually kind of interesting. I thought they would just focus on trying to encircle it instead of advancing on Avdiivka itself. However, the Russians did a mini offensive here and managed to capture various strong points of the pre-2014 or the pre-2022 defense line. So this blue line is like kind of the front line of where the Ukrainians have a defense perimeter where they which they established after the war in 2014 between the Donbass rebels and the Ukrainians. So right now they're trying to take they took this kind of like highway place right here, as you can see right here, and basically captured a lot of the pre-war defense lines. Now the main thing they're trying to advance here, from the looks of it, is to capture the main defense position of the Ukrainians in the Tarshka Otka. It's like some sort of abandoned hotel. There's many trenches here, and such, in this like kind of little forested area. And so, if the Russians manage to capture this outpost here and capture this forested area, they'll basically it'll be much easier to capture the residential area of Avdiivka here. But because the Ukrainians' defense line is basically along the forests here, and then in this like kind of high-rise buildings here, and then also in the Avdiivka coke plant, this like kind of industrial area. So they're fortified here, they're fortified here, but they're not really fortified in this area here. This is just kind of like buildings which are easily taken. So they want to keep the 2014 defense lines because this is, they're in tree lines and these natural kind of strong points, this filtration system, this area right here, this hotel. So the Russians have managed to advance from this area and capture more of this area here. But, obviously, I don't think they're trying to advance straight into Avdiivka. They're like trying to, I guess just try to complicate the Ukrainian defenses here to help when they advance from the south, from Opina to the quarry and onwards towards Severna. We see this with Rybar as well. We see that they took this the waste heap here and how they advanced to the north from Spartak and to the strong points of the Avdiivka in the south here, as we see here. Another thing to mention here, some sources have said this, but this has kind of happened during the weekend, is that the Ukrainians are launching a counterattack in near Peremyska, and so the Russians are, there's like some sources say it's not true, but I don't have enough information because it happened like within the last day or so. But the Ukrainians are trying to pressure on this area. The Ukrainians still have troops here, and if they pressure the Russians who are focused up here, that this will complicate the southern defenses here. So the Russians also have to keep in mind this area right here. So Peremyska is also another, and there's been bombings here, and this is a place that the Russians have to also take into consideration in this Avdiivka offensive, because if the Ukrainians push here, then they'll complicate the defenses of Adania and Opina, which are the staging points to advance from the south. So the Russians took a bit more gains, especially in the south. This week, the offensive continues in Avdiivka. This wasn't just a one-off. This was obviously a pre-planned offensive, and so we'll see if the Russians continue. And it's going to be slow. It's not going to be captured next week, or it might not even be captured next month. But it's going to be slow. But that's basically what we should expect. There's been a lot of losses, especially with there's been a lot of Russian vehicle losses. Not as much as the Ukrainians on their first offensive with armored vehicles, but there's been plenty. So this has been a very intense battle. But if they capture Avdiivka, then it was worth it. But if they somehow just can't push through and capture these villages and can't break through it, then um, then there's then it would have been for nothing. So we'll have to see if the Russians will be able to encircle it. I think they can, but again, this is one of the strongest points in the Ukrainian defense line. So we have to keep that in mind. In terms of the rest of the Donetsk front, in terms of Marinka, Novomikhailivka, this area right here, there's been no other really major changes or any changes really at all this week, besides Avdiivka. The next place that actually, where the Ukrainians are actually on the attack is actually in Kherson. So we're going to go to the Kherson front here. We're going to go to Kherson here. And there's actually, so as we mentioned in the last few videos, is that while there's been like very little movement in this area, there's been, artillery duels, strikes, and so forth. But this week, I think we could say the Ukrainian Kherson offensive has started. We've talked about how they've been planning this for a month or two now, for a little while, and and they've actually started. So we don't know if this is like their big push, or if this is just like kind of like a distract. These are like just the beginnings of like kind of reconnaissance before they do their main push somewhere, and this is just to distract. If we look at Rybar's map for Kherson, there's two villages we need to talk about. So in the beginning of this week, where the fighting is, we need to go to the villages of, it's called Podmomia and Pishantkika. So the Ukrainians managed to cross from this village right here, land on the islands, and actually advanced and actually entered these two villages, and almost captured them. But however, this a Russian counterattack before they could. Cause obviously, the purpose of capturing this was to put fire control the main highway, which is kind of like how the Russians supplied their troops along this defense line. And so, they almost captured these villages, or they entered them and tried to secure it. But then the Russians did a counterattack and basically pushed the Ukrainians back to the islands. They still say they have like a position on the islands here. The same thing in Dacha, but they're not in this on the left bank anywhere. They're on the islands. So the Russians managed to repel one Ukrainian attack. Now, one Ukrainian attack that happened later this week, where the Russians are trying to dislodge the Ukrainians, but still at this moment have not, is in the village of Krinki right here. So they advanced, they crossed the Dnieper and actually established themselves along the village of Krinki right here. At the moment, there isn't, fighting is ongoing. As of the end of this week, the Ukrainians are still in this village. They're trying to basically put this highway under Ukrainian direct fire. However, that's kind of they're trying to establish themselves, but the Russians are counterattacking, and by the end of next week, we'll know the extent of if they're able to hold this bridgehead or not. So again, attacks here, but I believe these are more like kind of reconnaissance operations by the Ukrainians during the first steps of their Kherson offensive, so that they draw Russian forces here. A few sources say that the main Ukrainian attack is going to be here in the Kherson Spit, because if they capture this, then they could actually use this. They could actually use this river to for supplies and such, because right now they can't use it. Nikolaev is basically under blockade by the sea because the Russians could just attack. But if they capture this area, they could then open this the Nikolaev port. Another thing is that they want to attack in this area in Novokhovka to establish themselves here, and they're trying to draw Russian troops away from where their main offensive is going to be. So we don't really know the exact Ukrainian plans, but we could say that the beginning of the Ukrainian Kherson offensive, the second one, is starting. Now, I don't know how, this seems, we don't know the extent of the goals of this offensive. They might be thinking, hey, we're actually going to push and managed to cut off Crimea and actually just take the land bridge. Because again, they don't need to take the entire land bridge. All they really need, from a strategic perspective, is to cut Crimea off from the mainland, and then get close enough where they could bomb the Kerch bridge here. Which, if they manage to get here, they could put a HIMAR here and bomb the bridge and destroy it. So it could go to that extent. Sorry, just drinking some water. Or it could just be to draw Russian reserves away from Zaporizhzhia and just harass and complicate Russian logistics and defense lines along the Dnieper River. Because if they manage to secure themselves on the left bank, then it's kind of like it would complicate the defenses. Because if they manage to capture these villages along this bank here, then the Russians really will have a bad time for defense wise. And the Ukrainians could then put units here, consolidate, and try to push from here. So we'll see how successful they are. The first attempt pushed the Ukrainians out. They're still in Krinky, so we'll have to see if that stays. I think it won't, because again, it's like anything. It's easy. It's easy to kind of secure themselves on the islands with a few dozen people, but when you have like thousands of Russian soldiers here who could counterattack you, and you have only a few dozen people here, it's very hard to actually secure yourself. You need to have like a full-scale operation, but the Russians keep using fab bombs, keep using drones, and such to bomb this bank of the river to complicate Ukrainian attacks here. So the Ukrainian Kherson offensive has started. So both sides are doing their little offensives for this fall. Russians in Avdiivka or Donetsk in general, and the Ukrainians in Kherson. Let's talk about the Zaporizhzhia and what they call the South Donetsk area for a little bit. These were the main areas where the Ukrainians attacked in the summer. We've been talking about when we started this kind of weekly show. We always started talking about Zaporizhzhia and South Donetsk because this the main areas. Now these are kind of like sidebars. Now, just because there's no more active clashes here does not mean that clashes aren't happening in terms of intensity. So the intensity might be decreased, but the fighting is still ongoing. I mentioned this last week. There was actually this week a Ukrainian armored assault in this area, in the Zaporizhzhia front, where they advanced and tried to attack Verbova and Novopropkovka again. Maybe they thought that maybe the Russians withdrew units after 2 weeks of kind of like a lull, but the Russians managed to repel that attack. There's been no changes on the map here of note, but there's been it's like these little positional, as I mentioned last week, the Ukrainians want to secure this little salient, which means taking Kopany and such, and the Russians want to liquidate the salient, basically get rid of all this progress the Ukrainians made. They don't want to make some breakthrough and take maybe Orekov or something, but and the Ukrainians don't want to break through and take Tokmak, for example. That's impossible, as we saw, for at least with the current way things are. So there's still attacks here. There's still we see daily videos of Ukrainians having their vehicles blown up here, and Russian assaults and such. So and Ukrainian assaults as well. So this is still an active front line, but not as intense. It's just more of a positional nature. Same thing here on this edge, but also on the South Donetsk area near the Velika Novosolika front. These are also a positional offensive here. The Russians actually managed to advance north from Prynutina and are trying to basically secure themselves on the hills in this area here. Because if they can secure themselves here, then it's a lot easier to defend in terms of being able to repel the Ukrainian attack. Because again, the Ukrainians wanted to attack, take these two villages, take Kremenchuk, take Prynutia, and basically secure their flanks before they kept going south towards Staromilivka here. But they never managed to secure their flanks, and the Russians bombed Starmayorska and Orozhina, very often. So the Ukrainians basically and also the Ukrainians withdrew their marine units to Kherson for their offensive there. So this is also positional battle. The Russians aren't doing a major offensive here to maybe take Velika Novosolika, for example, but they are improving their positions a bit in a positional battle. The same thing in the Zaporizhzhia front, but no major like big changes on the front besides some pushes north from Prenutia. Also, sorry for any mispronunciations. Um, so that's the two major things, major fronts of this week. As I mentioned, there's been no other battles in the Donetsk front. On the Bakhmut front, there's been actually no changes this week. Again, it's kind of like Zaporozhye. Well, while there was a big intensity before, it's kind of been died down. But there's still, battles here. It's not like it's over. The Ukrainians are still trying to. Basically, the main clashes for the last few weeks have been along this rail line, and so the Ukrainians still attack here, trying to dislodge the Russians from here. But the Russians are still holding on, and the situation has remained the same since last week. But the battles on the southern edge are still ongoing. On the northern sector, it's been quiet along in the Severitsk front here. There's been no major changes here. On the Luhansk front, as I mentioned, the Russians are still doing their counteroffensive here. Now, I think from what I've seen, I think this is more like an active defense because the intensity that we saw in Avdiivka, is much larger than what we see in Luhansk. Like in Luhansk, along the Osko front in this area, it's basically kind of more of a slower offensive. And we see that this, and I think what this is that obviously because of the weather, the Russians aren't in a good position to attack in terms of with weather, but they are actively trying to improve their positions. Specifically in this area right here, in the Kupiansk front, in the northern sector of this front. They've been advancing near Avdiivka and trying to establish themselves along this village. And they've also been trying to secure themselves along Sinkovka, but, the battles for this forest have been very bloody, and they still haven't been able to capture this village. So this is where the main clashes are, in the northern sector right here. And, there's still battles ongoing here, but there's not been any changes on the front of note. There's also, as I mentioned, I think last week, but there hasn't been really big changes this week. There's also clashes in the middle part near Makivka, near this village called, let's see what it's called, Noviny Igorka here, but no changes on the middle front. And then in the Liman area, the southern portion of the Luhansk front, there hasn't been any big changes here as well. Positional battles in the Kremenaya forest, and this is actually where the Russians are more silent. They haven't actually really pushed in the southern portion, but they have advanced in the northern and middle portion, and such. So the southern portion is kind of more quiet. So this week there's been two front lines where there's been major clashes in Avdiivka and in Kherson. However, so we talked about those things, what the goals of the people of the parties are there, but that doesn't mean that other areas of the front there's no battles. There's basically been battles along the entire front for the most part, but from Zaporizhzhia to Bakhmut and such to Luhansk, it's been more of like a positional tactical battle, while as the battles here actually change on the map, where you can actually see the changes happening. So we'll have to follow that to see what happens. In terms of outside frontline news, the Ukrainians for the first time used their the Americans provided the Ukrainians the AWACS. It's AWACS, I believe it's called. The very long range missiles that you could put on HIMARS that the Ukrainians have been wanting. They could shoot up to about 190 kilometers, and they basically launched from here all the way to Berdansk. They bombed the airfield here, and they basically are trying to they blew up a bunch of helicopters. So that's the first use of those long range missiles, which are another big weapon that the Ukrainians got. But yeah, so there's that. And so, this new weapon is another tool that Ukrainians have that could change the battlefield, like HIMARS have. Not significantly. It's not like a Wunderwaffen, which a one weapon system would change the whole battle space. But again, it's this would have to force the Russians to have their air defense train to defeat those missiles, and for just and they have to adapt to it, which is another headache the Russians have to deal with. The Russians still do their they do strikes on the rear of the Ukrainians. That continues ongoing. They have also been one thing I haven't mentioned, I think in my past videos, is that Russians have a good of striking with missiles. Maybe like a factory or a repair plant in Cherkasky or in Poltava. Kind of in the rear, they can strike with missiles. But in terms of like the rear of the front, maybe 70, 80, 90 kilometers behind the front line, maybe like around this area. Um, the Russians really didn't have a good strike capability for like short range stuff, like maybe destroy. And so, for example, we've been seeing new Lancet prototypes. This is not this week, but this is just something I've noticed. Is like in this area, in the airport, in this city here, they've managed to take out a few Ukrainian MiG airframes here. They've also managed to keep bombing Ukrainian logistics and concentration of forces 50, 60 kilometers in the back here in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia, whereas before they've only been managed to kind of take them out in the front line here. So Russian kind of mid deep strikes, not complete deep strikes, but mid strikes with like Lancets and such, and have been increasing. So that helps them as well. So that's the video. There might be a slowdown in videos. I'm gonna be busy with my work for the next a little while, so I don't know when I'm gonna get back to making videos. I make like kind of weekly Twitter threads that kind of go over these as well. So I might continue doing that. And once I settle down and things get back to normal, I'll start making these videos again. But this is going to be the last kind of weekly video, maybe for like at least a week, maybe two. So but yeah, so that's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and share it around and comment if you have anything to comment. And I hope you guys subscribe as well. So aim high, wander on, from America with Russian love.